The president has extended the federal hiring freeze until July 15th. That will be a total of 175 days with no new hires across most federal jobs. This is causing a ripple effect that will impact millions of people. Who's getting hit the hardest, and what does this mean to you? Let's get into it. The start of the hiring freeze was on January 20th, 2025, which was literally day one of the president's second term. He also signed 25 other executive orders, but this one specifically said no new hires, no creating positions, and people who had job offers already, a lot of them were being rescinded. People had already gone on an interview. They had already passed round one of an interview and they were receiving emails, "We're no longer hiring for this position." Now, this hiring freeze was supposed to last 90 days. The White House specifically said within 90 days, OMB will submit a plan, and upon issuance of that plan, the memo would expire. Many people, to include myself, thought that this memo made it clear that the hiring freeze would be over on April 20th. And if that were the case, it would be the longest hiring freeze that President Trump has done. He did one in 2017 that lasted 79 days. But last week, the White House dropped a memo saying, "We're extending this until July 15th. So now we're getting a hard date, July 15th. That adds 89 days to this hiring freeze. It pretty much doubles it in duration. And this is the longest hiring freeze in the last 40 years. But it's not the longest in federal workforce history because we had two other presidents that had long hiring freeze. First, we had Ronald Reagan, a Republican. He imposed a 12-month hiring freeze. And then Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, imposed a 4 to 6 month hiring freeze. The reasons for both of those presidents to enact a hiring freeze, they're similar. It was to reduce inflation, to reduce federal spending, and to make the federal workforce smaller. Now, this new hiring freeze, it covers pretty much every agency to some degree. Now, some agencies are completely blacked out and they're not able to hire anybody. But then you have agencies like the Department of Defense or the Department of Homeland Security that if there is a need, then you can get an exemption and you can actually hire people. The White House is saying this is all about draining the swamp. Washington, D.C. being the swamp, draining the swamp, and also making the workforce leaner and more efficient. In a fact sheet, they wrote, "The American people elected President Trump to end ineffective government programs that empower government without achieving measurable results." They're framing this as a way to prioritize private sector jobs and also to show that they are a steward, that they are safeguarding the taxpayer dollar, that is being used efficiently. But let's look and see who's actually being impacted more and who's being impacted less. Number one, let's look at the Social Security Administration. We know that they're at historic lows. If you go back 30 years, the SSA was staffed higher than it is today. And the number of people that they're responsible for doing audits to provide customer service, customer support, that's only growing. The American population is growing, large part because of immigration, but it is growing every single year. And you need a workforce that's able to service that population. That's not really happening right now. And SSA is definitely going to be impacted by the hiring freeze. They're planning to cut 7,000 additional workers. They can't afford to cut that. To get someone hired and onboarded within that agency, you need an exemption from the commissioner himself. The SSA commissioner has the authority to grant exemptions in the midst of this hiring freeze. It's not a hiring manager. It's not a manager or a director of an office. It comes from the commissioner. Then you have the IRS. Their hiring freeze is pretty much indefinite. We talked about July 15th. That doesn't apply to the IRS. In fact, for the hiring freeze to be lifted from the IRS, you would need 4 people or 4 entities to come together. You would need DOJ to agree upon it. You would need the Secretary of Treasury to agree upon it. You would need the President to agree upon it. You would need OMB to agree upon it. That's what it's going to take. It's 4 entities that have to come together in order to say, yes, we should hire some more. They want nothing more. And by they, I mean the president's administration. They want nothing more than to reduce the IRS to the maximum amount allowable by law. That's how much they want to reduce the IRS. Even though the IRS processes 160 million tax returns a year and combats fraud that costs taxpayers billions of dollars. In 2023, the IRS only answered 29% of their calls. So, like 3 out of 10. 10 people called the IRS looking for solutions to their tax problems, and only 3 actually talked to a human being. Now, that's when you had a fully staffed IRS. You could even say it was overstaffed. But what's going to happen this year, moving on into next year, when you have an issue and you want to pick up the phone to give the IRS a call, or you want to email the IRS to figure out what's going on with your tax situation, what's going to end up happening is you're not going to hear anything for a period of weeks or months or anything at all. You would think that national security would be off limits. It would be untouchable. Most politicians, they support it. They like it. They agree with it. They want to keep funding it. They want to raise the funding, actually. And almost every year, their budget continues to grow. Check this chart out. It shows a steady growth from 1985 until today, where it's hovering right around $800 billion a year. But it wasn't safe from job cuts. The Secretary Pete Hegseth put out a memo after the hiring freeze declaring his own hiring freeze. So it's like a hiring freeze under a hiring freeze, just to reiterate they're not going to be hiring people. But you know who the number one agency right now who's hiring? It's the Department of Defense, because of how huge it is. You have critical positions in there that you must keep filled. So just because there's a hiring freeze, it doesn't mean that people aren't quitting. People are quitting every day for a new job, to go into the private sector, to retire for whatever reason, or they pass away. As these vacancies show up, you have to plug the hole. If you need an Intel analyst, you need an Intel analyst. If you need cybersecurity, then that's what you need. Whether or not there's a hiring freeze or not, you hire the individual and you plug that hole. And if you haven't heard about the CDC incident, the Child Development Center on a lot of military bases, they're not able to hire enough people to watch the kids. So you have your warfighters deploying, going on training exercises for multiple weeks, and their kids, they're usually at the CDC being watched by a professional. Well, that's not an option in a lot of places, especially Colorado. That's not an option. So it's disrupting military readiness across the nation. Then we have the General Services Administration, the GSA. They manage federal buildings and contracts. They imposed a freeze until the end of the year. And then earlier this month, in April, they have job postings for contracting officers. They're trying to hire contracting officers because there's a need, even though there's a freeze. But there's one category of government worker that is protected. You know who that is? Political appointees. Completely exempt. In fact, there was a memo that came out recently that reminded federal agencies you have great flexibility when you set their pay. Basically encouraging them to set their pay all the way up to $195,000 a year. This is the memo. Agencies have great flexibility in setting pay for Schedule C employees because such flexibility is important to attract high qualified Schedule C employees. Which is true, but the same could be said about all federal employees, not just Schedule C. You have a lot of career employees, not political, career, that are highly talented, that are attracted to high pay and benefits. But what this administration is saying to the career employee is, hey, you're not getting a federal pay raise in 2026, and also the stability and security of your job is being threatened. But for our Schedule C folks, you guys come on over here. We're going to try to make it as enticing as possible to get Schedule C. Now, we don't talk that much about Schedule C here because those jobs are not on usajobs.gov. Okay, you have to go a different route to get those type of jobs. And people who usually end up getting Schedule C, this is the path they take. 1, being politically connected or aligned. 2, building a political resume. 3, applying through the administration's website. And 4, being recommended by political leadership. Now, there's also a big difference between your political SES and Schedule C. A political SES is a leadership role typically, and Schedule C is more of a support role. So Schedule C is typically paid less. You know, political SES could be $200,000, $212,000, $220,000 a year, where Schedule C usually hovers around GS-13 pay or GS-14 in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, if you were interested for whatever reason to attain a Schedule C job, usually it would be posted on the White House website, but it's not, as of right now, it's not on there. You can go on LinkedIn. There's some conservative groups. If you join, the whole purpose of their existence is to screen candidates, whether or not they'll be a good fit working within the administration. Okay, so who's exempt from the hiring freeze? So first, it's going to be the same three categories that we talked about back in January. You have your national security, you have your immigration, you have your public safety and law enforcement. Also, it includes military personnel and staff in the executive office of the president, because they still want to keep their flexibility. They still want to hire people in there. And then finally, is positions that are tied to Social Security, Medicare, and veterans benefits. But we've seen how SSA has been struggling. So the question will remain, what are they going to do to deal with their shortage of workers? Because this time next year, if they continue down the same trajectory, they're going to be in deep trouble. Also, the Office of Personnel Management can grant exemptions if they're otherwise necessary, which is a vague phrase to kind of keep the door open just in case they have to do some emergency hiring. Maybe they need some nuclear specialists at the last minute. They can always use that. But what it does say here, and I think this is a great idea, it says agencies are banned from hiring contractors to skirt the freeze. This is what we saw during Bill Clinton. This is what we saw during Ronald Reagan. You reduce the workforce, but then you augment it with the private sector, with contractors. So this is specifically saying, do not do that. Now, will the agencies listen? We'll see. But here's a big part of the order. Even when July 15th gets here and the federal hiring freeze lifts, federal hiring will not go back to normal. So this is because of the 4-to-1 rule that the White House is imposing. Federal agencies can only hire one employee for every 4 that leave. And it doesn't matter why they leave. They could have been laid off, quit, retire, passed away, any reason. They just have to leave. So what we're going to see is a 75% reduction throughout 2025. And in most years, about 100,000 federal employees, they leave the federal workforce. So that means that the government would be able to hire 25,000 people. The other 75,000, they're going to be gone. Now, that's just, typical years. This is not a typical year. So you consider the deferred resignation program, you consider all the incentives, they're going to end up hiring a lot more than that. This 4-to-1 rule, it mirrors Trump's 10-to-1 deregulation order, where agencies must cut 10 rules for every 1 rule they create. But when we look back on history, President Trump is not the first one to propose a ratio. Now, this is the most severe ratio because if you look back to President Jimmy Carter, he imposed a 1-to-2 ratio in the 1970s. So agencies were only allowed to hire 1 for every 2 that left. But if you zoom out, depending on how you look at the federal workforce, it's been on a downward trend. Like if you look back, let's say 15 years. 15 years ago, the government was at 2.2 million. Today, we're at 2.1 million. We have definitely grown over the last 15 years. Everyone can agree to that. What people don't agree on is, well, just because the population grows doesn't mean our federal workforce should have to grow. And that's true. It doesn't necessarily mean that because of technology and because of automation, innovation, all that stuff. But still, you want to ensure that you have enough people to support the American public. And support means all kinds of different things. It's not just the highways that the Department of Transportation is responsible for. It's not just the clean water that the EPA is responsible for. It's a lot of other things. Veteran Affairs, Social Security. There's so many agencies that impact people's lives that they simply don't even realize. They take it for granted because it just happens. You go to the airport, you jump on a plane, you head to Disney World, you don't even think about the air traffic controller. Do you think about the air traffic? I don't think about the air traffic controller, but there's somebody from FAA that's there directing the aircraft traffic, and that's an essential part. So there's so much more that goes into the federal workforce that is seen, that is truly seen and appreciated, and instead, the alternative narrative is the federal workforce is somehow in bed or they're somehow considered the deep state. Usually when people say the deep state, they're looking at the federal law enforcement agencies. They're looking at the DEA, the FBI, ATF, CIA, all those folks. That's a small percentage of what's going on in the federal workforce. And we also cannot forget that agencies right now are unrolling their reduction in forces, their RIFs. So how many people do you think will be around towards the end of the year? How many federal employees will lose their job? Well, I have a guess. And this is kind of shot in the dark, but this is pretty much my line of thinking when it comes to the reduction in the workforce. We have 55,000 confirmed layoffs. 76,000 people took deferred resignation program the first time, 49,000 took it the second time, and then we have 150,000 employees through planned reductions. So in total, over 300,000 workers gone. So I think that's a good estimate for 2025. A third of a million federal employees out of their jobs. 300, 330, 350,000. Now that's going to impact the economies in those areas. And the federal government is slowly creating a reputation of stay away, we don't want you. And this is a huge deal when you're trying to attract people into IT, when you're trying to attract people that are specialized in AI. This is what is called a talent drain. The federal government competes with the private sector for talent. So when it comes to AI, when it comes to cybersecurity, they're competing against Amazon, Tesla, Google. They're competing because the specialized individuals, they go there. They don't go to the federal government. So this gives them less of a reason. Last year, the government hired 1,200 AI specialists compared to 10,000 that were hired in the private sector. So as we continue to go down this path, how much harder will it be for the federal government to actually attract and recruit and then retain those people within its federal agencies? It's going to be quite difficult. Not just that, though. We're also getting word of a federal pay freeze. It's not bad enough that they're cutting jobs, they're forcing people to be laid off, that they're giving little to no notice before you're out of a job. No, on top of that, someone at the White House thought it was a great idea to go ahead and do a pay freeze. So that way your actual dollars, your salary, how much you get paid, your buying power is dramatically reduced. If you want to know more about the 2026 pay freeze, check this video out next. Stay updated by signing up to the free newsletter down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.